My sister-in-law secretly recorded me in labor and posted it online for money. My sister-in-law Brittany has been obsessed with becoming an influencer for years. 20,000 followers, barely any engagement, constantly begging the family to be in her content. I always refused. I value my privacy, especially when I got pregnant. I made it crystal clear. No photos of me pregnant, no baby shower content, and absolutely no filming during delivery. My husband Kyle backed me completely, and we even chose a hospital with strict no filming policies. Brittany acted disappointed but supportive. "Your birth, your rules," she chirped. She even volunteered to wait outside during labor. When my water broke at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, Kyle called his family while we raced to the hospital. Brittany showed up an hour later with coffee for Kyle. "I'll keep everyone updated from the waiting room," she promised. Transition labor hit like a brick wall. Kyle looked pale and overwhelmed, so the nurse suggested he take a 5-minute break. I could barely speak through the pain when Brittany stepped in. "I'll stay with her," she said. And she did, holding my hand, encouraging me through contractions. For a moment, I genuinely felt grateful. Labor lasted 18 hours. Brittany rotated in whenever Kyle needed a moment. She saw everything. Me screaming, crying, exposed, begging for it to be over. She saw things most people never want anyone outside their spouse or doctor to witness. Our daughter, Jenna, was born at 8 p.m. Brittany cried with us, took a few pictures that we approved, and hugged me like she was truly part of something sacred. 3 weeks later, my phone exploded. Missed calls, messages, notifications. My mom's voice was frantic. "Have you seen what Brittany posted?" My stomach dropped. She promised she didn't film anything. "Check TikTok, now." The first thing I saw was Brittany's viral video. Watching my sister-in-law give birth, emotional, gone wrong. I felt the blood drain from my body. She had hidden cameras, one in her purse, another in her coffee cup, a button camera on her shirt. 20 hours of footage turned into a documentary. It showed everything. Me fully exposed, spread open, crowning shots, angles even Kyle hadn't seen. Me sobbing that I wanted to die, screaming at Kyle that labor was his fault. The doctor discussing my 3rd-degree tear in graphic detail. Me defecating while pushing. My body at its most vulnerable moment broadcast to millions. The comments were vicious. People mocking my body, my pain, my performance. Someone screenshot my crowning moment and turned it into a meme. My vagina was literally a meme. But the worst part wasn't the humiliation. She monetized it. She sold unedited footage to a birth fetish website for $49.99 and made over $75,000 in 3 weeks. I called Kyle sobbing. He was already racing home. "Don't do anything. I'm handling it." But I couldn't stop watching as Brittany uploaded more videos. Day in the life with my postpartum SIL. She doesn't know I'm filming. Clips of me crying from breastfeeding pain. My bloody postpartum pads in the trash. Shots of me looking exhausted and swollen. When Kyle got home, he slammed the door. "I called a lawyer. We're suing her. Everything is coming down." "It's too late," I whispered. "It's everywhere, even on porn sites." Then Kyle's mom called. "Did you give Brittany permission for the documentary?" "What documentary?" "TLC bought the rights for a new show. She says you signed a release." My heart stopped. I never signed anything. She sent a screenshot, a release with my signature dated the day I gave birth. It hit me. During transition, Brittany had shoved a clipboard into my hand. "Hospital needs this signed," she said. I was delirious with pain. I signed blindly. Kyle called Brittany and put her on speaker. "It's just content," she said cheerfully. "You're being dramatic. Everyone gives birth." "You filmed her vagina," Kyle yelled. "You sold the footage." "It's educational content, raising awareness," and she signed the release. She was in labor. "It's still legally binding." My lawyer checked. I grabbed the phone. "Take it down or I swear. You can't ruin me. The hospital loves the publicity. They made your birth their beautiful birth story of the month." I checked. My exposed body was on the hospital's official webpage. That night, I got DMs from strangers. "I bought your birth video. You looked prettier pregnant. Those stretch marks, though. Yikes. My wife passed out watching you push. Too graphic." My milk dried up. Jenna cried nonstop. Kyle spent hours with lawyers. And Brittany posted a teary video about how we were bullying her for being successful. Her followers attacked us, calling us jealous, abusive, controlling. A week later, my principal called. Parents had seen the videos. I was a kindergarten teacher. I was placed on administrative leave. Then came a registered letter from TLC. They were moving forward with Brittany's show. The contract she signed granted them rights to all footage of the birth mother for 2 years. My lawyer explained the nightmare. The release form is questionable, but it will take years to challenge. And she has text messages claiming you asked her to film. The screenshots showed messages from my number. "Make sure you get everything. This will make us famous." Kyle stepped in. These were sent while she was pushing. She couldn't have used her phone. The lawyer nodded grimly. Proving she had your phone is possible, but difficult. That night, the local news aired a segment. Brittany cried on camera, claiming I begged her to film and was now jealous. But then, a nurse from my delivery room spoke out. I saw multiple hidden cameras. The patient had no idea. The hospital brushed it off. They threatened my job for speaking up. We're filing a joint lawsuit. My phone rang again. Unknown number. Is this Jenna's mom? I'm a producer at Netflix. We're doing a documentary on consent and social media abuse. We want to buy exclusive rights to your story and dismantle TLC's claim. I just want the videos gone, I whispered. We can make that happen. But you need to see something first. He emailed screenshots from Brittany's secret Instagram, her Project Birth page. She'd been planning for months, staging everything, including a post that made me physically nauseous. Final phase tomorrow. Slip her the Pitocin during visit. Labor should start within hours. She drugged me. She induced my labor without consent. And the producer added, she's done this before. You weren't her first victim. I stare at the producer's email showing Brittany's secret Instagram page where she'd been planning Project Birth for months, and the words, slip her the Pitocin during visit, make my hands shake so violently I nearly drop my phone. She didn't just violate my privacy. She drugged me to induce my labor without consent so she could film it on her schedule. Kyle reads over my shoulder and his face goes completely white before he grabs his car keys, saying he's driving to Brittany's apartment right now to confront her. I stop Kyle at the door because charging over there angry could hurt our legal case, and we call Brian Austin instead. The privacy attorney the Netflix producer recommended answers, even though it's 9 p.m. and listens to everything. He tells us not to contact Brittany directly, because we need law enforcement involved immediately for the drugging evidence. He says this transforms the case from privacy violation to assault, and he's calling a detective he knows tonight. Detective Ramona Gilmore arrives at our house by 10 p.m. with another officer, and she's all business as she photographs the Instagram screenshots on my phone. She explains that giving someone medication without consent is a serious crime, and combined with the hidden cameras and exploitation, Brittany is facing multiple felony charges. Ramona asks detailed questions about the timeline. When did Brittany visit before my water broke? What did she bring me? Did I eat or drink anything she provided? I remember Brittany bringing me herbal tea that afternoon, claiming it would help with late pregnancy discomfort, and I drank the whole cup because I trusted her completely. Kyle confirms he saw her in our kitchen alone for several minutes, and Ramona notes this as opportunity to tamper with my drink. She bags the teacup that's still in our sink as potential evidence, though she warns that proving what was in it weeks later will be challenging. Ramona contacts the hospital immediately to secure my complete medical records, specifically looking for when contractions started and how quickly labor progressed. She explains that Pitocin typically causes faster, more intense labor than natural onset, and the medical timeline might show suspicious patterns. The hospital initially resists releasing records at night, but Ramona threatens a warrant and they comply within an hour. By midnight, we're reviewing my medical chart with Ramona, and the labor nurse's notes show my contractions went from 0 to active labor unusually fast. The pattern is consistent with artificial induction. There's also a note that I seemed confused about timeline when admitted, thinking my water had broken naturally at home. Ramona circles this as evidence that I didn't understand what was happening to my body, because Brittany had chemically altered it. The next morning, Brian Austin arrives with a forensic tech specialist who examines all of Brittany's posted videos frame by frame. They're looking for evidence of the hidden cameras themselves and timestamps that prove premeditation. The tech finds reflections in windows and mirrors, showing Brittany adjusting her button camera and metadata, revealing she'd been recording for hours before I even knew I was in labor. Brian explains our legal strategy. We'll pursue both criminal charges through Ramona's investigation and civil lawsuits against Brittany, TLC, and the hospital. The criminal case addresses the assault and unauthorized recording, while civil suits target the financial exploitation and institutional negligence. He warns this will take months and be emotionally draining, but the evidence is stronger than most cases he's seen. Kyle's mom, Jacqueline, calls demanding to know why police visited Brittany's apartment that morning with a search warrant. Kyle puts her on speaker and tells her everything. The drugging evidence, the premeditation, the previous victims the producer mentioned. Jacqueline's voice wavers between disbelief and defensiveness, insisting Brittany wouldn't drug anyone, until Kyle asks point blank if she wants to see the Instagram posts where Brittany literally planned it in writing. Jacqueline goes silent for a long moment, then asks to see the evidence herself because she needs to understand what her daughter actually did. We send her screenshots, and an hour later she calls back crying, saying she had no idea Brittany was capable of this level of deception and violation. She promises to cooperate fully with the investigation, though I can hear her heart breaking over the phone as she processes that her daughter is a predator. Ramona called the next morning while I was feeding Jenna. Her voice had that careful tone cops use when they're about to drop something heavy. They'd executed the search warrant at Brittany's apartment at dawn and seized everything, 3 computers, 2 phones, a tablet, and 6 different camera devices. The forensic tech was already pulling files, and what they found made Ramona pause. Folders. Dozens of folders organized by women's names, each containing similar footage to mine. Medical situations, vulnerable moments, intimate procedures. Some dated back 2 years. Brittany hadn't stumbled into this. She'd built an entire business exploiting women when they were too weak or distracted to notice cameras. The fetish website communications showed regular uploads, negotiated pricing, requests for specific types of content. She'd been doing this systematically, targeting women in hospitals, clinics, even a dentist's office where someone was under sedation. My hands shook so badly I had to put Jenna down in her bassinet. Ramona was working to identify the other victims, though many of the folder names were just first names or nicknames. Some women might never know they were filmed. The realization hit me like ice water. Brittany chose me specifically because I was family. She had access other victims wouldn't give a stranger. She could walk into my hospital room, sit beside my bed, hold my hand while secretly recording everything. The trust made her job easier. Kyle came home early from work and found me staring at my phone, Jenna crying because I'd forgotten to burp her. He took the baby and listened while I repeated everything Ramona said. His face went gray when I got to the part about 2 years of victims. His sister hadn't made one terrible mistake. She was a predator who'd refined her methods over dozens of violations. Brian called an hour later with news that moved faster than I expected from the legal system. He'd filed an emergency motion that morning to freeze Brittany's bank accounts, and the judge granted it by noon. The $75,000 she'd made from my footage was now locked down, inaccessible until the criminal case resolved. Brian also filed for an immediate injunction against TLC, demanding they halt all broadcast plans for Brittany's show. TLC's lawyers responded within hours, fighting hard. Their argument was simple. Brittany signed a valid contract. I signed a release form. Everything was legal and binding. But Brian had ammunition now. The criminal investigation changed everything. He told the judge about the drugging evidence, the premeditation, the hidden cameras, the other victims. The judge ordered a hearing for the following week to determine whether TLC's contract was obtained through fraud. Brian sounded almost excited when he explained how corporate stonewalling often backfired once evidence proved wrongdoing. TLC thought they had an airtight contract, but contracts signed under duress or based on fraudulent representations weren't worth the paper they were printed on. Kyle's mom called that evening, her voice small and broken. She'd been contacted by police as part of their investigation, asked about Brittany's behavior over the past few years. Had Jacqueline noticed anything unusual? Any comments about filming people without permission? Any unexplained income? No. Jacqueline was crying as she asked if we thought Brittany could really be helped, if there was treatment for whatever was wrong with her. Kyle's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice gentle as he explained that Brittany wasn't sick, she was calculating. The Instagram posts proved she'd planned everything methodically. The 2 years of victims proved she knew exactly what she was doing, and chose to do it anyway. Jacqueline went quiet for a long time, then asked if she could see the evidence herself, because she needed to stop defending someone she didn't actually know anymore. I had to return to the hospital the following Tuesday for a 6-week postpartum checkup. Walking through those automatic doors made my chest tighten until breathing felt like work. These were the same hallways where Brittany had violated me, the same nurses' station where staff were ignored Winter's concerns, the same building that put my exposed body on their website for promotional content. My hands were shaking as I checked in, and the receptionist's cheerful greeting felt like she was speaking a foreign language. Winter spotted me in the hallway outside the OB clinic. She looked thinner than I remembered, her scrubs hanging loose like she'd lost weight from stress. She approached carefully, the way you'd approach a scared animal, and asked if we could talk privately. Her voice was nervous but determined, and something in her expression made me agree. We found an empty consultation room down the hall, one of those small spaces with a desk and 2 chairs and motivational posters about healthy pregnancies. Winter closed the door and immediately started apologizing, words tumbling out fast like she'd been rehearsing them. She'd documented everything that day, every hidden camera she spotted, every time she brought concerns to her supervisor, every dismissive response from the hospital administration. She'd kept copies of her nursing notes, screenshots of the emails she sent flagging the suspicious filming, even photos she'd taken of Brittany's button camera when she noticed it during a position change. Winter had been placed on administrative leave after speaking to the news, told she violated patient privacy by discussing my case publicly. But she had everything backed up at home, and she was willing to testify about the hospital's complete failure to protect me. Her voice shook as she apologized for not doing more in the moment, for not physically removing Brittany from the room or calling security. I reached across the desk and squeezed her hand, thanking her for being the only person who even tried. She was the one staff member who saw something wrong and refused to ignore it, even when it cost her job. Winter offered to connect me with the hospital's patient advocate, though she warned me the woman usually protected the institution rather than patients. We walked together to the advocate's office, a corner room with windows overlooking the parking lot and furniture that looked expensive enough to suggest the hospital took patient relations seriously, in theory, if not practice. The advocate, a middle-aged woman in a blazer with a frozen smile, gestured for me to sit. She offered a generic apology about my experience and vague promises of policy review, but refused to admit the hospital did anything wrong. Every sentence was carefully worded to avoid liability. Unfortunate situation, instead of violation. Reviewing protocols, instead of acknowledging failure. When I mentioned that my lawyer was preparing a lawsuit, her smile disappeared completely. She stood up, handed me a business card, and said all further communication needed to go through the hospital's legal department. The meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. Winter walked me back to the elevator, apologizing again for how useless that conversation was. She'd warned me, but experiencing the institutional brush-off firsthand still felt like a slap. The hospital cared more about protecting itself than acknowledging they'd let someone film my birth without interference. Barrett Snyder sent a formal letter 2 days later. The hospital administrator's response was everything Brian had hoped for: defensive, dismissive, and documented. The letter claimed the hospital staff followed all protocols and had no reason to suspect unauthorized filming. It refused to acknowledge Winter's concerns or explain why they'd featured my birth on their website without verifying I'd consented to public promotion. The tone was corporate arrogance wrapped in legal language, insisting the hospital bore zero responsibility for what happened in their facility. Brian actually smiled when he read it, explaining that this kind of stonewalling often destroyed defendants in court. Juries hated institutions that refused to admit obvious mistakes, and this letter would look terrible when Winter testified about being silenced. Brian immediately filed subpoenas for all hospital communications about my birth, emails between administrators, staff meeting minutes, any documentation about their decision to use my delivery for promotional content. He was building a case that the hospital not only failed to protect me, but actively profited from my violation by using it for marketing. The TLC hearing arrived the following Thursday at the county courthouse. Kyle and I sat behind Brian at a long table facing the judge, while TLC's legal team filled the opposite side with 3 lawyers in expensive suits. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, wood-paneled and formal, with a bailiff standing near the door and a court reporter typing every word. TLC's lead lawyer stood first, arguing that the release form I signed was legally binding regardless of circumstances. He held up a copy of my signature, pointing out that I was an adult who signed a legal document. The circumstances of signing didn't matter, only the signature itself. Brian stood for our response, and his voice was calm but sharp as he countered with expert testimony. He'd brought a medical expert who explained capacity to consent during active labor, comparing it to signing contracts under the influence of heavy drugs. The judge watched video clips Brian had prepared, footage of me during transition, clearly delirious with pain, barely able to speak coherent sentences. The judge's expression shifted from neutral to disturbed as she watched me screaming and crying, obviously not in any state to understand legal documents. She leaned forward and asked TLC's lawyer directly how anyone could claim I had the mental capacity to comprehend what I was signing in that condition. TLC's lawyer made a critical mistake then. He argued that birth was a natural process, and I should have expected to be filmed in a hospital setting, that medical facilities were inherently public spaces where privacy expectations were reduced. The judge cut him off mid-sentence, her voice sharp enough to make everyone in the courtroom sit up straighter. She stated clearly that medical procedures required informed consent, and nothing about hidden cameras was standard hospital practice. Patients had every right to expect privacy during vulnerable medical moments, and suggesting otherwise was absurd. She granted our injunction immediately, halting all of TLC's broadcast plans pending resolution of the criminal case against Brittany. She also ordered TLC to surrender all footage to the court for safekeeping, ensuring they couldn't edit or distribute it while the case proceeded. Brian squeezed my shoulder as we left the courtroom, and I felt like I could breathe properly for the first time in weeks. TLC's show wasn't happening. The footage was locked away. We'd won something real. Brittany's lawyer reached out to Brian that same afternoon, which told us everything about how confident they felt about trial. Lawyers don't ask about plea deals when they think they can win. Brian refused to discuss any deal until we saw the full scope of charges, but he called to tell us the contact had been made. Ramona confirmed later that evening that the district attorney was preparing a multi-count indictment. The charges were stacking up: assault for the drugging, unauthorized recording in a private space, exploitation of intimate images, fraud related to the forged release form, and potentially more depending on what they found in Brittany's files about other victims. Chandler Bright, the prosecutor assigned to the case, was known for taking digital exploitation seriously. Ramona said he'd already spent hours reviewing evidence and was building something comprehensive. The criminal case was moving forward with momentum that felt almost frightening after weeks of feeling powerless. Brittany was going to face real consequences, and the evidence was strong enough that even her lawyer knew it. Tamara called 3 days later with a formal offer. She wanted to document everything as part of her Netflix series on consent violations in social media. Complete editorial control would stay with us. We'd approve every frame before anything aired. The payment would cover our legal costs and then some. Kyle and I sat at our kitchen table staring at the contract she'd emailed. More cameras felt wrong after what Brittany did. The idea of filming anything made my skin crawl. But Brian pointed out something we hadn't considered. Brittany was all over social media playing victim. Her followers believed her version where I was jealous and vindictive. We had no voice in this story she'd created. The documentary could give us that voice. Kyle rubbed his face with both hands. Jenna was asleep in her bassinet next to us. He asked if I could handle being on camera again. I thought about the viral videos, the memes, the comments mocking my body. Strangers had already seen me at my most vulnerable. Maybe controlling the narrative this time would feel different. Maybe taking back the story Brittany stole would help me heal. We called Brian and talked through every detail. He reviewed the contract line by line. No footage of Jenna, no recreations of the birth. We approve everything before broadcast. Tamara had included every protection we'd asked for. Brian said it was the most favorable documentary agreement he'd ever seen. We signed it that night. Tamara arrived the following week with a small crew. Just her, a camera operator, and a sound technician. She set up in our living room with soft lighting that didn't feel clinical or harsh. She started by asking us to tell her what happened in our own words. Kyle held my hand as I described trusting Brittany during labor. The hidden cameras, the viral videos, finding out she'd drugged me. Tamara didn't interrupt or redirect. She just listened and let me talk. When I got to the part about my crowning moment becoming a meme, my voice cracked. Tamara stopped filming immediately and asked if I needed a break. We sat there for 10 minutes while I collected myself. Then I asked her to start recording again. I wanted to finish. Talking on camera felt different from I'd expected. Not exploitative or invasive. More like reclaiming something that had been taken. Like I was taking back the story Brittany had stolen and telling it the way it actually happened. Tamara filmed for 3 hours that first day. She asked about the emotional impact, the professional consequences, the ongoing legal battles. She treated us like people, not content. When she left, Kyle said he actually felt better having talked through it all. I realized I did too. Ramona called 2 days later with news about Brittany's seized files. She'd found folders labeled with 3 other women's names. All contained similar footage to what Brittany had taken of me. Medical situations, vulnerable moments, hidden camera angles. One woman named Demi Potter had agreed to meet with me. Ramona gave me her number and said Demi wanted to talk to another victim. I called that afternoon. Demi's voice shook when she answered. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop the next morning. I got there early and sat in a corner booth. Demi walked in 10 minutes later looking around nervously. She was younger than me, maybe mid-20s. Her hands trembled as she sat down. She ordered tea she never drank. Then she told me what Brittany had done to her. Demi had been 16 weeks pregnant when she started bleeding. Brittany had been working as a doula and showed up at the hospital offering support. Demi thought she was there to help. Instead, Brittany filmed everything. The miscarriage. Demi crying. The doctor explaining she'd lost the baby. All of it captured on hidden cameras. Brittany sold that footage to the same fetish website. Demi only found out 6 months later when someone recognized her and sent her the link. Listening to Demi made me physically sick. What Brittany did to me was horrible. But exploiting someone during pregnancy loss felt even more predatory. Demi kept apologizing for crying. I reached across the table and held her hand. She explained that she never reported it because she was ashamed. Brittany was a family friend. Who would believe that someone trusted to support women through childbirth would secretly film their trauma and sell it? But now she wanted to press charges. She wanted Brittany to face consequences for what she'd done. Ramona had already told her this would help both our cases. Pattern evidence showing Brittany had done this multiple times. It proved premeditation and predatory behavior. Demi asked if I thought she was stupid for trusting Brittany. I told her the same thing I kept telling myself. We weren't stupid. Brittany was calculating and manipulative. She targeted vulnerable women during medical crises when we couldn't protect ourselves. That made her a predator, not us victims. Ramona updated us about the other 2 victims later that week. One had moved to another state and wasn't returning calls. The other was too traumatized to participate in prosecution. She'd seen Demi's name in the case files and explicitly said she couldn't handle going through a trial. Ramona respected that decision but said it meant our case relied heavily on me and Demi. We decided to move forward together. Demi texted me that night asking if we could stay in touch. I suggested starting a private group chat where we could vent about the investigation and share coping strategies. She added me immediately. We started messaging daily about everything from dealing with lawyers to managing trauma triggers. Having someone who understood exactly what I was going through made the whole process feel less isolating. Demi got it in a way even Kyle couldn't. She knew what it felt like to have your most vulnerable moment turned into entertainment for strangers. My principal called requesting a meeting about my employment status. The message was formal and cold. I knew what it meant. Parents were still concerned about the videos. The school board was involved now. I asked Brian to come with me as my representative. We arrived at the principal's office on a Tuesday afternoon. She sat behind her desk looking uncomfortable. 2 school board members were there too. The principal explained that parents had been calling constantly. They'd seen the videos online. Some were threatening to pull their kids from my class. The school board was pressuring her to terminate my contract. One board member said they had to consider the children's well-being. Brian didn't let me respond. He calmly laid out evidence on her desk. Police reports. The criminal investigation. Proof that I was a crime victim who'd been drugged and secretly filmed. He explained that I never created adult content or consented to any recording. Then he looked directly at the board members and said that firing me would constitute illegal retaliation against a victim of sexual exploitation. He had case law ready. Precedents where schools had been sued for exactly this kind of discrimination. The room went quiet. The school board scheduled a closed hearing for the following week. I had to explain what happened while a dozen administrators stared at me with varying levels of sympathy and judgment. Some looked genuinely concerned. Others seemed skeptical, like they thought I must have done something to deserve this. I sat at a table facing them and described Brittany's betrayal. The hidden cameras, the drugging evidence, the ongoing criminal investigation. My voice stayed steady even though I was dying inside. Having to justify my right to keep teaching because someone violated me felt like being assaulted all over again. Brian presented Winter's testimony about witnessing the hidden cameras. He showed them the Instagram evidence of Brittany's months of planning. He made it crystal clear that I had zero knowledge or consent. One board member asked if I'd considered how this affected the school's reputation. Brian cut in before I could answer. He pointed out that punishing crime victims for being victimized would damage their reputation far more than supporting a teacher who'd done nothing wrong. The board deliberated for 2 hours while Brian and I waited in the hallway. I could hear muffled voices through the door but couldn't make out words. Brian kept checking his phone and reassuring me that we had a strong case. Finally, they called us back in. The board voted to end my administrative leave and return me to full employment. The principal looked relieved. She apologized for how parents had reacted and promised to send a letter to families clarifying that I was a crime victim. It was a victory. I got to keep my job. But the fact that I'd had to fight for it after being assaulted left me feeling bitter about how victims get treated. Like we have to prove we're innocent of our own violation. Like being exploited somehow makes us less worthy of basic respect. Brian packed up his files and said this outcome would strengthen our civil case. I just felt exhausted. Returning to my kindergarten classroom felt surreal after everything. 5-year-olds don't know about viral videos or birth exploitation. They just wanted to show me their drawings and hear stories. Their innocence was healing in a way I didn't anticipate. Nobody asked where I'd been. They were just happy I was back. I threw myself into teaching with renewed purpose. Work became the place where I wasn't a victim. Just Ms. Teacher who does silly voices during story time and helps tie shoes and wipes tears over playground disputes. The kids didn't care about anything that happened. They cared about whether we'd do art today and if they could be line leader. That simplicity felt like medicine. Every morning I walked into that classroom and left the legal battles and trauma at the door. For 6 hours a day, I got to be someone other than the woman whose birth went viral. I got to be the teacher who made learning fun. Chandler Bright called wanting to meet about the criminal charges. Kyle and I drove to his office downtown on a Friday afternoon. Chandler was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. He laid out the indictment he was filing against Brittany. 4 felony counts, 3 misdemeanors, assault for the drugging, unauthorized recording in a private space, exploitation of intimate images, fraud related to the forged release form, potential prison time of 8 to 15 years if convicted on all counts. Chandler was confident about the evidence. The Instagram posts showing premeditation, the forensic analysis proving the drugging, Winter's testimony about the hidden cameras, Demi's case establishing pattern behavior. But he warned us that Brittany's lawyer would try to paint her as a naive influencer who made a mistake, not a calculating predator who'd been running an exploitation business for years. The jury would need to see through that defense. Chandler asked if we were prepared for trial, for having our trauma examined in public, for facing Brittany in court. Kyle squeezed my hand. I told Chandler we were ready. We wanted Brittany to face real consequences for what she'd done. Not just to us, but to Demi and the other victims who couldn't come forward. Chandler nodded and said he'd make sure justice was served. I checked my phone the next morning and found Brittany's TikTok account completely empty. Every single video was gone. Her Instagram showed the same thing, just a blank profile with 20,000 followers and 0 posts. Her lawyer must have told her to shut everything down, which meant she knew how bad this was. But her followers didn't stop. Within hours, they started flooding social media with Free Britney hashtags, claiming she was attacked for being successful. The comments made me sick. People calling me jealous, saying I was trying to ruin a woman's career out of spite, accusing me of lying about the whole thing. Someone even started a petition demanding charges be dropped. I threw my phone across the couch and watched it bounce off the cushions. Demi texted me 5 minutes later asking if I'd seen the hashtag. I told her I couldn't look at it anymore. She replied immediately, reminding me that none of it mattered. The evidence was what counted, not what random strangers thought on the internet. The jury would see the truth. I knew she was right, but reading those comments still made my chest tight. Kyle's mom called that afternoon. Her voice sounded small and broken when I answered. She asked if she could come visit and meet Jenna. I stood in the kitchen holding the phone, feeling this weird mix of anger and sympathy. Part of me wanted to tell her no, that she raised someone capable of drugging me and filming my birth. But another part remembered that she'd been cooperating with Ramona, that she seemed genuinely horrified by what her daughter did. Kyle took the phone from me and talked to his mom for a few minutes. After he hung up, he said she deserved a chance. She was losing her daughter to prison and just wanted to know her granddaughter. I agreed, but told him there had to be rules. 1 hour at our house. She could see Jenna, but not hold her until I felt ready. Kyle nodded and called his mom back to set it up. Jacqueline arrived Saturday morning carrying 2 gift bags and looking like she'd aged 10 years since I last saw her. Her eyes were red and puffy, and her hands shook when she set the bags down on our coffee table. She started crying the moment she saw Jenna in my arms, apologizing over and over while tears streamed down her face. She tried to explain how she missed the signs, how she never imagined Brittany could do something so cruel. The gifts she brought felt wrong somehow, like she was trying to make up for her daughter's crimes with baby clothes and stuffed animals. I had to keep reminding myself that she was grieving, that she'd lost the daughter she thought she had. Kyle sat next to his mom and put his arm around her shoulders. He told her gently, but firmly, that what Brittany did was unforgivable, that there was no excuse for drugging someone and filming them without consent. Jacqueline nodded and wiped her face with a tissue, saying she knew that she couldn't defend it anymore. She looked at Jenna with such sadness in her eyes, and I realized she was mourning not just her daughter, but also the grandmother relationship she might never fully have. After an hour, I let her hold Jenna for 5 minutes. She cried the whole time. Brian called on Monday with news that made my stomach drop. His team had been digging through Brittany's seized computers and found email exchanges with the fetish website going back almost a year. They'd been planning a birth content partnership long before I even got pregnant. Brittany had pitched herself as someone with special access to pregnant family members, essentially offering to deliver victims for their site. The emails showed her discussing payment structures, video quality requirements, and how to hide cameras effectively. She'd told them she had a sister who was due soon, which meant she'd been targeting me specifically for months. The website operators were now under federal investigation for conspiracy and exploitation. Brian said this added a whole new layer to our case because it proved Brittany wasn't just an influencer who made a bad choice. She was running a criminal operation. I hung up and sat on the floor of Jenna's nursery, trying to process that my sister had planned this for almost a year. Every family dinner, every baby shower, every time she acted supportive, she'd been plotting how to drug me and film my birth for money. Ramona called 2 days later with the forensic results from my teacup. They found traces of synthetic oxytocin, the medical-grade Pitocin used to induce labor. Brittany had somehow gotten her hands on prescription medication and slipped it into my tea without my knowledge. Ramona traced the purchase to a veterinary supply company where Brittany had used fake credentials to order it months earlier. That meant fraud charges on top of everything else, plus illegal possession of prescription drugs. Ramona explained that this evidence destroyed any possible claim that the drugging was accidental, or that I imagined it. There was physical proof that Brittany had chemically altered my body to force labor on her schedule. I asked Ramona how someone could do that to another person, especially family. She said she'd been asking herself the same question since this case started. She'd seen a lot of crimes in her career, but this level of premeditation and betrayal was rare. Tamara scheduled a joint interview with Demi and me for the Netflix documentary the following week. We met at a studio downtown where they'd set up cameras and lighting that felt less intrusive than I expected. Tamara asked us to talk about how Brittany targeted vulnerable women during medical experiences. Demi went first, describing how Brittany had posed as a supportive doula during her miscarriage, and then sold footage of her grief to strangers. Her voice stayed steady, but I could see her hands trembling in her lap. When it was my turn, I talked about the unique violation of having someone you trust exploit your body during the most vulnerable moment imaginable. How it wasn't just about privacy, but about having your physical autonomy stolen during a medical event. Tamara listened carefully and asked follow-up questions that focused on our strength and advocacy rather than just dwelling on the trauma. By the end, I started seeing how this documentary could actually help other victims recognize when they'd been exploited and know they weren't alone. My therapist helped me work through something I'd been struggling with since Jenna was born. She called it complicated grief, the loss of the birth experience I'd planned, and how Jenna's arrival was now forever connected to Brittany's crimes. I kept telling myself I should just be grateful Jenna was healthy, that the violation didn't matter compared to having my daughter. But my therapist explained that both things could be true. I could love Jenna completely while also mourning that her birth was stolen from me. She helped me practice separating Jenna from the trauma, seeing her as the beautiful outcome even though the day she arrived was ruined. It was slow work that made me cry in every session. Some days I looked at Jenna and only felt joy. Other days I remembered hidden cameras recording me at my most exposed and felt sick. My therapist said healing wasn't linear, that I'd have good days and bad days for a long time. Winter called me in tears one evening. The hospital had cut her shifts in half and moved her to the worst rotation despite her seniority. Other nurses were treating her coldly, and her supervisor had written her up twice for minor things that normally wouldn't matter. She knew it was retaliation for speaking up about the hidden cameras. Brian added her situation to our civil lawsuit against the hospital, arguing they were punishing a whistleblower for exposing their negligence. Winter said she was scared about her career, that she'd worked so hard to become a labor and delivery nurse and now it might all be destroyed. But she also said she'd do it again, that she couldn't have stayed silent after seeing what happened to me. I told her she was braver than anyone I'd ever met, risking everything to support victims she barely knew. She said she just did what any decent person should do, which made me realize how rare that actually was. Brittany's arraignment was scheduled for a cold morning in March. I went with Kyle, Demi, and Ramona, all of us sitting in the back of the courtroom while we waited for the case to be called. When they brought Brittany in, she looked smaller than she did in her social media videos. She wore a conservative navy dress that her lawyer obviously picked out, and she kept her eyes on the floor as she walked to the defendant's table. The judge read the charges out loud. 4 felonies including assault and unauthorized recording, 3 misdemeanors. Potential 15 years in prison if convicted on everything. Brittany's voice was so quiet when she said not guilty that the judge had to ask her to repeat it. I sat there watching her and felt nothing but emptiness. No anger, no satisfaction, just this hollow feeling that this person I'd trusted had destroyed so much. The judge set bail at $100,000. Brittany's parents posted it within an hour using their house as collateral. I watched Jacqueline sign the paperwork with shaking hands, looking devastated as she put her home on the line for someone who'd committed such terrible crimes. For a second, I almost felt sorry for her. Then I remembered she was bailing out someone who drugged me, filmed me without consent, and sold the footage for profit. The judge released Brittany with strict conditions. No social media of any kind, no contact with victims, GPS monitoring bracelet, surrender of passport. Brittany nodded at each requirement, still not looking at anyone. As she left the courtroom with her parents, I realized this was just the beginning. The real trial was still months away. 2 days after Brittany left the courtroom, Brian called asking us to come to his office. Kyle and I drove there in silence, Jenna asleep in her car seat. Brian's assistant led us to a conference room where he had papers spread across the table. He looked tired but focused as he slid a document toward us. The hospital was offering $500,000 to settle the civil suit. Kyle reached for the paper, but Brian put his hand over it. The money came with one condition. We had to sign a non-disclosure agreement. We couldn't talk about what happened, couldn't tell anyone about the hospital's role, couldn't warn other patients. Brian leaned back in his chair and told us to reject it. The evidence we had was strong enough to win much more at trial. But more importantly, an NDA would silence us forever. I stared at the number on the page. $500,000 would change our lives. We could pay off the house, start Jenna's college fund, never worry about medical bills again. But then I thought about Winter losing her job for speaking up. I thought about other women giving birth in that hospital with no idea their privacy could be violated. I pushed the paper back across the table. Kyle nodded and told Brian we were rejecting the offer. Brian smiled and said that was exactly what he hoped we'd say. He started preparing for trial. 3 weeks later, Brian's paralegal came running into his office during a discovery review session. She had found something in the hospital's internal documents. Winter wasn't the first nurse to report concerns about filming in delivery rooms. There had been 3 previous complaints over the past 18 months. Different nurses, different patients, all ignored by administration. Brian spread the documents across the table, his hands shaking with excitement. One nurse reported seeing a visitor with multiple phones positioned around the room. Another noticed a woman adjusting what looked like a camera in her purse. A third documented suspicious behavior from a family member who kept leaving and returning to the delivery room. Every single complaint went to the same administrator, Barrett Snyder. Every single one was dismissed as paranoia or misunderstanding. The hospital had a pattern of ignoring warnings about privacy violations. Brian immediately filed an amended complaint adding systemic negligence charges. Within 48 hours, the hospital's lawyers called requesting another settlement meeting. This time they wanted to negotiate without an NDA. The evidence of ignored complaints changed everything. They knew a jury would crucify them for protecting their reputation over patient safety. Brian told them we'd consider their offer after they fired Barrett and implemented new privacy protocols. They agreed within a week. I was feeding Jenna in the kitchen when Kyle's phone started buzzing with notifications. He picked it up and his face went pale. Brittany had violated her bail conditions. She created a secret TikTok account under a different name and posted videos playing the victim. The posts were cryptic but clear to anyone following the case. She talked about being misunderstood, about family betrayal, about how the justice system punishes success. Kyle showed me the videos and I felt sick watching her perform innocence. Ramona called 20 minutes later. She had found the account within 48 hours of its creation. Social media monitoring was part of Brittany's bail conditions, and Ramona's team had been watching for exactly this kind of violation. She was filing a motion to revoke bail immediately. The hearing was scheduled for the next morning. We sat in the courtroom as Brittany was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit. Her lawyer tried to argue she didn't understand the social media ban applied to secret accounts. The judge cut him off mid-sentence. Brittany built her entire career on social media. She understood platforms better than most people understood their own jobs. Claiming ignorance about what constituted social media use was insulting to the court's intelligence. The judge revoked her bail and ordered her held without bond until trial. Brittany started crying, reaching for her parents as the bailiff led her away. Jacqueline sobbed in the gallery, but I felt nothing watching Brittany lose her freedom. She took mine first. With Brittany in jail, her lawyer's tone changed completely during the next call with Chandler. They wanted to discuss a plea deal. Chandler met with us at his office to present the offer. Brittany would plead guilty to 2 felony counts in exchange for dropping the other charges. The prosecution would recommend 5 years in prison. Demi came to the meeting too, since any plea deal would affect her case as well. We sat around Chandler's conference table while he explained the math. A plea deal meant certainty. 5 years guaranteed, no risk of acquittal, no chance of Brittany walking free. But trial meant we could push for the full 15 years if we won on all counts. It also meant we could lose. Juries were unpredictable. Brittany's lawyer would make her sympathetic, would paint her as a young woman caught up in influencer culture who made a terrible mistake. Demi asked what he thought we should do. Chandler was quiet for a moment, then said the evidence was exceptionally strong. The drugging, the premeditation, the Instagram planning posts. He believed we could win at trial. But he also said 5 years was more than most defendants got for similar crimes. The decision was ours. I looked at Demi and she looked at me. We both knew what the other was thinking. 5 years wasn't enough for someone who built a business exploiting vulnerable women. We scheduled another meeting with Chandler the following week to give our final answer. He walked us through every risk of going to trial. Juries could sympathize with Brittany despite the evidence. Her lawyer would argue she was addicted to social media, that she needed treatment, not prison. They would show her crying, remorseful, claiming she never meant to hurt anyone. Chandler would counter with the planning documents, the drugging evidence, the multiple victims. He would prove this wasn't impulse but calculated exploitation. But juries were human, and humans made emotional decisions. There was always a chance they'd see Brittany as a misguided young woman instead of a predator. Demi spoke first. She said 5 years felt like a slap in the face for what Brittany did to her during the worst moment of her life. I agreed. Brittany didn't just violate our privacy once. She built an entire business model around exploiting women in medical crises. She had files on multiple victims. She sold our most intimate moments for profit. 5 years wasn't justice. We told Chandler to reject the plea offer. We were going to trial. Chandler nodded and said he would start preparing immediately. Trial was scheduled for 8 weeks away. The next 6 weeks blurred together in a mess of preparation and anxiety. Brian and Chandler coordinated between the criminal and civil cases, making sure evidence from one could support the other. I had to review all the footage Brittany took without actually watching it. Chandler's paralegal would describe what was shown in each file, and I would confirm whether that matched what happened during my labor. Just hearing the descriptions made me want to throw up. Footage of me fully exposed during examinations. Close-ups of crowning. Audio of me screaming that I wanted to die. Video of medical staff discussing my third-degree tear. Every file was another violation I had to acknowledge and confirm for the court record. Kyle sat with me during every review session, holding my hand while I verified the scope of what Brittany had stolen. Some nights I couldn't sleep after the sessions. I would lie awake thinking about strangers watching those moments, about my body being sold on fetish websites, about Jenna someday learning what happened the day she was born. But I forced myself through every session because my testimony was crucial to proving how extensive the violation was. Tamara and her Netflix documentary team filmed our trial preparation. They set up cameras in Brian's office and recorded strategy sessions, witness prep, and the emotional toll of reliving everything. Tamara interviewed expert witnesses who would testify at trial. A psychiatrist explained how consent capacity disappears during active labor due to pain and altered mental states. A technology expert demonstrated how sophisticated Brittany's hidden camera setup was, proving premeditation. A victim advocate discussed the psychological impact of having intimate images exploited without consent. The documentary was becoming something bigger than just our story. Tamara was examining how social media platforms incentivize violation by rewarding engagement over ethics. She interviewed other victims of digital exploitation, other families torn apart by someone's quest for online fame. The footage showed how legal systems struggled to address crimes that didn't exist 20 years ago. How do you prosecute someone for violations that happen in digital spaces? How do you protect people when technology moves faster than laws? Tamara's team captured all of it. building a powerful examination of consent in the social media age. While my criminal case moved toward trial, Demi's case was moving forward too. Prosecutors charged Brittany with additional crimes related to filming Demi's miscarriage without consent. The exploitation of pregnancy loss carried its own charges, separate from what she did to me. Having multiple victims with nearly identical patterns destroyed any claim that Brittany made an innocent mistake. This wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment. This was a business model. Brittany's lawyer started floating higher plea offers. 7 years, then 8. Each time we rejected them. Chandler would call with the new offer and we would say no without hesitation. Brittany's lawyer was getting desperate as trial approached. The evidence was overwhelming and they knew it. But we weren't interested in making things easier for her. She didn't make things easier for us when she drugged me and filmed my labor. She didn't make things easier for Demi when she exploited her miscarriage. We were going to trial and we were going to make sure a jury heard everything she did. Jury selection took 3 full days. Chandler and Brittany's lawyer questioned potential jurors about their social media use, their opinions on influencers, their understanding of digital privacy. We needed jurors who understood internet culture, but wouldn't sympathize with Brittany's defense that she was just creating content. The process was exhausting. Potential jurors were dismissed for being too sympathetic to influencers, too harsh on social media users, too biased against the medical system. Chandler used his challenges strategically, removing anyone who seemed likely to buy the addiction defense. Brittany's lawyer tried to seat younger jurors who might understand influencer pressure, but Chandler blocked most of them. After 3 days, we had our jury. 7 women and 5 men. A retired teacher, a software engineer, a nurse, a construction worker, an accountant, a retail manager, a bank teller, a mechanic, a social worker, a librarian, a sales representative, and a dental hygienist. They looked like regular people who would understand that what Brittany did was wrong, regardless of her motivations. Chandler seemed satisfied with the selection. Trial would begin the following Monday. The courtroom was packed on the first day of trial. Kyle and I sat behind the prosecution table with Demi beside us. Jacqueline sat on the other side of the room near Brittany's lawyer. Ramona sat in the back with Winter, both there to support us and testify when called. The judge entered and everyone stood. Brittany was brought in wearing a conservative dress her lawyer clearly chose to make her look innocent and young. She didn't look at us as she sat down. Chandler stood and walked to the jury box to deliver his opening statement. He described how Brittany turned my birth into a business transaction without my knowledge or consent. He walked them through the timeline step by step. The months of planning documented on her secret Instagram. The purchase of hidden cameras. The drugging with Pitocin to control when my labor started. The positioning of cameras throughout the delivery room. The exploitation of my most vulnerable moments. The sale of footage to fetish websites. The lies about having my permission. Chandler pulled up the Instagram posts on a screen visible to the jury. They showed Brittany literally planning what she called Project Birth, like it was a military operation. The jury looked horrified as they read her posts about slipping me drugs and capturing everything on camera. Chandler's voice was steady and powerful as he promised to prove every element of Brittany's calculated exploitation. When he finished, several jurors were staring at Brittany with obvious disgust. The trial had begun and we were ready to fight. The next morning, I sat in the witness room with Brian, my hands shaking so badly I had to grip my knees to keep them still. Chandler came in to prep me one last time, reminding me to speak clearly and directly to the jury. He walked me through the questions he'd ask, the timeline I needed to explain, the moments that mattered most. Kyle squeezed my hand before they called me in. The courtroom felt massive as I walked to the witness stand, every eye on me as I raised my right hand and swore to tell the truth. Chandler started gently, asking me to describe my relationship with Brittany before Jenna's birth. I explained how I'd trusted her completely, how she'd been in the delivery room holding my hand during the worst pain of my life. He asked about the release form, and I described the clipboard she'd shoved at me during transition, how I'd been so delirious with pain I could barely see straight. The jury leaned forward as I explained signing something I thought was hospital paperwork, never imagining it was permission to exploit me. Chandler asked when I first discovered the videos, and my voice cracked as I described that morning 3 weeks after Jenna's birth, seeing my most vulnerable moment broadcast to millions. He guided me through each violation, the hidden cameras, the fetish website, the memes made from my crowning moment. I held myself together until he asked how it felt to learn Brittany had drugged me. Something broke inside me then, and tears streamed down my face as I explained that she didn't just violate my privacy. She chemically controlled my body to create content. She took away my choice about when and how my daughter was born. She induced my labor without my knowledge or consent, so she could film it on her schedule. My voice shook as I said that every time I look at Jenna's birth photos, I remember that hidden cameras were recording my exposed body for strangers to buy and watch. The jury sat completely still, several women with tears in their eyes. Brittany's lawyer stood for cross-examination, his tone immediately aggressive as he suggested I was exaggerating the trauma for sympathy. Brian had prepared me for this, so I kept my voice steady as I corrected each false statement with facts. He implied I'd known about the filming, and I calmly pointed out that hidden cameras are called hidden for a reason. He tried to suggest I'd invited Brittany into the delivery room, and I explained that Kyle had stepped out for 5 minutes, and she'd volunteered to stay with me during a contraction. The lawyer's voice dripped with accusation as he asked if I'd benefited from the publicity, if my social media following had increased, if I'd received any money or opportunities. I looked directly at the jury and said that being turned into a meme while crowning is not a benefit. Having strangers buy footage of my vagina is not an opportunity. Fighting to keep my teaching job because parents saw me at my most raw is not publicity I wanted. This violation is something I'll carry forever, and no amount of followers or attention could ever make up for having the most vulnerable moment of my life stolen and sold. The lawyer tried a few more questions, but Brian's preparation had been thorough, and I refused to let him twist my words or minimize what Brittany had done. When I finally stepped down, my legs felt like rubber, but I'd told my truth clearly and completely. Winter took the stand next, her nurse's uniform replaced by a simple dress, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She described working in labor and delivery for 8 years, her voice professional and clear as she walked through the events of Jenna's birth. Chandler asked when she first noticed something wrong, and Winter explained seeing Brittany adjust something on her shirt that looked like a camera lens. She'd spotted the coffee cup positioned at a suspicious angle, the purse with a hole cut in the side pointing directly at me. Winter's voice grew stronger as she described reporting her concerns to her supervisor, who'd dismissed them immediately. The hospital administrator had told her to focus on her job and stop making trouble. When she'd persisted, pointing out that patients had a right to privacy during medical procedures, she'd been threatened with termination. The jury took extensive notes as Winter described being silenced by institutional priorities, watching a patient be violated while her concerns were brushed aside. One juror, an older woman in the front row, shook her head in disgust. Winter explained that after the videos went viral, she'd been placed on administrative leave for speaking to the media, punished for trying to protect a patient after the fact since she couldn't protect me in the moment. Chandler asked if she'd documented her concerns, and Winter pulled out a folder of notes she'd made that day, time-stamped entries describing each camera she'd spotted and each time she'd tried to get someone to intervene. The evidence was damning for both Brittany and the hospital, proving that medical professionals had noticed the violation in real time, but institutional negligence had allowed it to continue. Demi took the stand after lunch, her voice quiet but steady as she described meeting Brittany at a pregnancy loss support group. Brittany had offered to be her doula during the miscarriage, claiming she wanted to support women through difficult medical experiences. Demi had trusted her completely, grateful to have someone present who understood pregnancy loss. Her voice broke as she described the 16-week miscarriage, the physical pain and emotional devastation, Brittany holding her hand and promising everything would be okay. 6 months later, someone had sent Demi a link to the fetish website where footage of her miscarriage was being sold. The jury looked horrified as Demi explained seeing herself at her most broken moment, exposed and grieving, turned into content for strangers to purchase. Chandler asked about the similarities between her experience and mine, and Demi listed them methodically. Hidden cameras, vulnerable medical moment, betrayal of trust, sale to fetish website, claims of having permission that didn't exist. The pattern was identical, destroying any defense that Brittany's exploitation of me had been a one-time mistake or lapse in judgment. This was what Brittany did. She targeted vulnerable women during medical experiences, gained their trust, and sold their most private moments for profit. The prosecution rested after presenting the forensic evidence of the Pitocin in my teacup, the fake veterinary credentials Brittany had used to obtain it, the timeline showing how my labor had started within hours of drinking the tea she'd brought me. Brittany's lawyer looked defeated before the defense case even began, shuffling papers without meeting anyone's eyes. Brittany took the stand the next morning, exactly as Brian had predicted she would. Her narcissism wouldn't let her stay silent, wouldn't let her lawyer control the narrative without her input. She wore a soft pink sweater that made her look young and innocent, her makeup minimal, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Tears streamed down her face as she apologized, her voice shaking as she claimed she'd gotten caught up in influencer culture. She said she'd never meant to hurt anyone, that she'd thought she was creating educational content about birth, that she'd convinced herself I'd be grateful for the documentation. The jury watched her with mixed expressions as she painted herself as a victim of social media pressure, someone who'd made terrible choices but deserved understanding. But then Chandler stood for cross-examination and everything changed. He pulled up the Instagram posts from Project Birth, making Brittany read them aloud to the jury. Her voice faltered as she read her own words about slipping me the Pitocin, capturing everything on camera, making sure the angles were perfect. Chandler asked about the veterinary supply fraud, and Brittany stammered that she'd panicked and made a mistake. He asked about the fetish website communications, and she claimed she hadn't known what kind of site it was. Chandler pulled up her emails discussing content categories and pricing structures, proving she'd known exactly what she was selling and to whom. He asked about Demi, and Brittany tried to claim that was different, that she'd been younger then and didn't know better. Chandler systematically destroyed every excuse, every attempt to minimize or justify, until Brittany sat crying on the stand with her own premeditation and calculated cruelty laid bare for the jury to see. The defense called an expert witness after Brittany stepped down, a psychologist who specialized in social media addiction. He testified that Brittany suffered from a compulsive need for online validation that impaired her judgment and decision-making. He compared her behavior to gambling addiction, claiming she couldn't control her need to create content and gain followers. The jury looked skeptical as he tried to paint Brittany as a victim of Instagram culture, someone whose addiction made her unable to understand the harm she was causing. Chandler's rebuttal expert, a psychiatrist with 30 years of experience, took the stand and calmly dismantled the addiction defense. She explained that addiction doesn't cause the level of premeditation Brittany had demonstrated, that someone in the grip of compulsion doesn't spend months planning an exploitation scheme. She walked through the evidence of calculated behavior, the fake credentials, the hidden camera purchases, the communications with the fetish website. None of that showed impaired judgment or loss of control. It showed someone making deliberate choices to violate and exploit vulnerable women for financial gain. The jury took notes as the psychiatrist explained that Brittany's behavior pattern indicated antisocial personality traits, not addiction, and that her tears on the stand were more likely manipulation than genuine remorse. Several jurors nodded as she spoke, and I felt a surge of hope that they could see through Brittany's performance. Closing arguments happened on Friday afternoon, the courtroom packed with observers and media. Chandler stood before the jury and delivered a summary that made my chest tight with emotion. He described how Brittany had turned one of life's most sacred moments into a commodity, how she'd drugged me to control when my daughter was born so she could capture better content. He reminded them that assault doesn't require physical violence, that giving someone medication without their knowledge or consent is assault regardless of motivation. He walked through each piece of evidence, each witness testimony, each moment of calculated cruelty. Brittany hadn't made a mistake. She'd executed a plan. She'd targeted vulnerable women, gained their trust, and sold their most private moments to strangers. The jury sat transfixed as Chandler asked them to hold Brittany accountable for every choice she'd made, every violation she'd committed, every life she'd damaged in pursuit of online fame and money. Brittany's lawyer made his closing argument next, a last attempt to generate sympathy by claiming his client was young and misguided, caught up in a culture that values content over consent. He asked the jury to show mercy, to consider that Brittany had apologized and shown remorse. But his words felt empty after everything the jury had seen and heard, hollow appeals for compassion towards someone who'd shown none to her victims. The jury deliberated for 7 hours while we waited in a private room down the hall. Kyle held my hand as we sat in silence, too nervous to eat or talk. Demi paced by the window. Brian checked his phone constantly. Ramona came by twice to tell us the length of deliberation was actually a good sign, that it meant they were taking the charges seriously and reviewing all the evidence carefully. Finally, at 6 p.m, we got the call that the jury had reached a verdict. My heart pounded as we walked back into the courtroom, taking our seats while Brittany was brought in looking pale and scared. The judge entered and asked the foreperson to stand. The woman rose, a retired teacher in her 60s, and held the verdict form with steady hands. Guilty on count 1, unauthorized recording. Guilty on count 2, distribution of intimate images. Guilty on count 3, assault by drugging. Guilty on count 4, fraud. Guilty on all 3 misdemeanor counts. I started crying as Kyle wrapped his arms around me, the relief so overwhelming I could barely breathe. Across the aisle, I heard Jacqueline sobbing as her daughter was convicted on every single charge. Brittany's face crumpled as the judge thanked the jury and set a sentencing date for 3 weeks later. Guards led Brittany away in handcuffs, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like justice might actually happen. Chandler called me 2 days later to discuss the sentencing phase. He explained that both sides would present impact statements and recommendations, that the judge would consider sentencing guidelines and the specific circumstances of Brittany's crimes. He asked me to write a victim impact statement describing how her actions had affected my life, something that would help the judge understand the full scope of damage beyond the legal violations. I spent the next week drafting and redrafting, trying to capture the magnitude of what Brittany had stolen from me without sounding vengeful or bitter. I wanted the judge to understand that this wasn't about punishment for its own sake. It was about acknowledging that what Brittany did had permanent consequences. I wrote about the therapy sessions, the panic attacks when people take out their phones, the way Jenna's birth photos are tainted by knowing hidden cameras were recording. I wrote about fighting to keep my teaching job, about the memes that still circulate online, about the strangers who bought footage of my most vulnerable moment. I wrote about the autonomy she stole when she drugged me, how she took away my choice about when and how my daughter entered the world. Brian reviewed my statement and said it was powerful and honest, exactly what the judge needed to hear. The sentencing hearing arrived on a cold morning in late fall. The courtroom felt different now, heavier somehow, as we waited for the proceedings to begin. Brittany was brought in wearing the same conservative outfit from trial, her face puffy from crying. The judge asked if I wanted to read my statement, and I stood on shaking legs, walking to the podium with my printed pages. I looked directly at Brittany as I began reading, describing how she'd stolen the most vulnerable moment of my life and turned it into entertainment for strangers. My voice stayed steady as I explained that I can't look at Jenna's birth photos without remembering that hidden cameras were recording my exposed body, that I flinch when people take out their phones around me, that I had to fight to keep my teaching job because parents saw footage of me at my most raw and broken. I told the judge that Brittany didn't just violate my privacy, she chemically controlled my body to create content, taking away my autonomy over when and how my daughter was born. I explained that strangers have seen parts of me that even my husband hadn't seen from those angles, that my crowning moment became a meme shared by thousands. I described the permanent damage to my sense of safety and trust, the way this violation will be with me forever, even if all the videos eventually disappear from the internet. Brittany cried throughout my statement but never looked at me, her shoulders shaking as I laid out exactly what her crimes had cost me. Demi stood next, her hands gripping the podium as she unfolded her own statement. Her voice shook at first, but grew stronger as she described the miscarriage at 16 weeks, how Brittany had posed as a supportive doula while secretly filming her most devastating loss. She explained finding the footage 6 months later on the same fetish site, discovering strangers had purchased and watched her grief. The judge leaned forward, listening with visible concern as Demi detailed the betrayal of trust during medical trauma, the exploitation of pregnancy loss for profit. When Demi finished, she looked directly at Brittany and said she hoped prison would teach her that human suffering isn't content. The courtroom stayed silent as Demi returned to her seat beside me, and I squeezed her hand while the judge reviewed her notes. The judge spent several minutes reading through sentencing guidelines and examining the evidence binders Brian had submitted. She commented that the premeditation, the drugging, the pattern of exploitation across multiple victims, and the sale of intimate footage demonstrated calculated predatory behavior rather than poor judgment. The sentence came down firm and clear: 12 years in prison with possibility of parole after 8, plus lifetime registration as a sex offender for the distribution of intimate images without consent. Brittany's lawyer immediately requested the judge reconsider, arguing the sentence exceeded the plea offer, but the judge stated the aggravating factors warranted the higher sentence. I felt Kyle's arm around me as the words sank in. It was more time than the 5 years she'd been offered in the plea deal, but less than the maximum 15 years Chandler had pushed for. Relief washed through me, but it felt hollow somehow, like no amount of prison time could actually undo what she'd done. Brittany sobbed as the bailiff led her away in handcuffs, and Jacqueline's crying echoed across the courtroom. Outside, reporters swarmed us with cameras and microphones, but Brian guided us to his car without stopping for questions. 2 months passed before the civil trial against the hospital began. Brian had spent that time building an overwhelming case of negligence, compiling Winter's documentation, the previous complaints about filming concerns that administrators had ignored, and expert testimony about standard patient privacy protocols. The hospital's legal team arrived with 3 lawyers and a defensive strategy claiming they'd followed all standard procedures. Brian methodically demolished that argument over 5 days of testimony. Winter took the stand and described spotting the hidden cameras, reporting her concerns to her supervisor and being told to mind her own business because the family seemed happy. She explained how the supervisor later threatened her job when she persisted and how she'd kept detailed contemporaneous notes of every conversation. The hospital's lawyers tried to discredit her, suggesting she was biased or seeking attention, but Winter stayed calm and factual. She produced emails showing she'd raised concerns within 2 hours of my delivery, long before any public controversy. Brian called the 3 nurses who'd previously reported suspicious filming behavior in other deliveries, and their testimony established a pattern of administrative indifference to patient privacy. The hospital administrator who'd dismissed Winter's concerns looked increasingly uncomfortable as Brian questioned him about why patient safety took a backseat to avoiding conflict with families. The jury watched footage of my birth appearing on the hospital's promotional webpage, heard testimony about how quickly they'd capitalized on the publicity without verifying I'd actually consented. Brian's closing argument focused on institutional responsibility, how hospitals have a duty to protect vulnerable patients even when it's inconvenient. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. When they returned, the 4 women announced verdicts on all counts: negligence in maintaining patient privacy, retaliation against a whistleblower employee, failure to enforce their own no-filming policies. The damage award came in at $2. $3 million, split between compensatory and punitive damages. Kyle and I would receive $1.5 million in compensatory damages for the violation and its consequences, plus $800,000 in punitive damages meant to punish the hospital's deliberate indifference. Winter received $400,000 for wrongful retaliation and the career damage she'd suffered. The hospital's lawyers immediately filed notice of appeal, but Brian wasn't worried. He said the evidence was too strong and the jury's verdict was well supported. TLC made their move 3 weeks after the hospital verdict. Their lawyers contacted Brian with a settlement offer that included dropping all broadcast plans, paying an undisclosed sum for advocacy work, and guaranteeing permanent removal of all footage from their servers. Brian negotiated hard, getting them to add legal guarantees that the footage wouldn't be sold or licensed to anyone else, ever. The settlement amount was enough to fund years of advocacy work helping other victims, and I signed the agreement with relief that at least one piece of this nightmare was ending. Around the same time, federal prosecutors indicted the fetish website operators on charges of conspiracy to exploit intimate images and distribution of non-consensual content. Their business model had involved actively recruiting people like Britney to secretly film vulnerable women during medical procedures. As part of plea agreements to avoid trial, the operators agreed to permanently delete all exploitative content from their servers, pay restitution to identified victims, and cooperate with ongoing investigations into similar websites. Brian helped me file a claim in the restitution process, though he warned the actual payments would likely be minimal since the operators had hidden most of their profits in offshore accounts. 6 months after Britney's sentencing, the Netflix documentary premiered. Tamara had spent those months editing hundreds of hours of footage into a 90-minute film that focused on systemic issues rather than just sensationalizing individual trauma. She'd interviewed legal experts who explained gaps in laws protecting medical privacy, medical ethicists who discussed informed consent in vulnerable situations, and multiple victims of social media exploitation who shared their stories. Demi and I appeared throughout, but Tamara had respected our boundaries about what footage to include and how to frame our experiences. The documentary opened with statistics about non-consensual intimate image sharing, then used our cases to examine how social media incentivizes violation and how institutions often prioritize reputation over victim protection. Reviews praised the film's approach, calling it a necessary examination of consent in the digital age. Viewers flooded social media with supportive messages, thanking us for speaking out and demanding stronger laws. Several state legislators contacted us about drafting medical privacy legislation, and advocacy groups reached out about partnering on awareness campaigns. The response felt validating in a way I hadn't expected, like our trauma was actually creating meaningful change instead of just being consumed as entertainment. I used part of the settlement money to establish the Medical Privacy Legal Fund, a nonprofit providing free legal representation to victims of intimate image exploitation in healthcare settings. Demi joined as co-director, and we worked with Brian to create a network of attorneys willing to take cases pro bono or at reduced rates. We developed resources explaining victims' rights, step-by-step guides for reporting violations, and template legal documents people could use to protect themselves. The work was healing in a way therapy alone couldn't achieve. Every victim we helped felt like we were taking back power from people like Britney, turning our violation into tangible support for others. We hired a small staff, rented office space, and within 6 months had helped 43 victims file complaints, lawsuits, or criminal charges against people who'd exploited them. Some cases involved secret filming during childbirth like mine. Others involved non-consensual sharing of medical procedures or examinations. Each story reminded me how common this violation was, how many people suffered in silence because they didn't know they had options. My relationship with Jacqueline rebuilt slowly over the following year, though it would never be what it was before. She'd been devastated by Britney's conviction, struggling with guilt over missing warning signs, and grief over losing her daughter to prison. Kyle suggested family therapy, and after several sessions of just Kyle and his mom, I agreed to join. The therapist helped Jacqueline process her complicated feelings without making me responsible for managing them. Jacqueline acknowledged she'd been defensive initially, unable to accept that her daughter was capable of such calculated cruelty. She apologized for not believing me immediately, for making excuses, for posting Britney's bail. I accepted her apology but explained that trust would take time to rebuild. She respected that boundary and focused on being present for Jenna without pushing for more access than I was comfortable giving. Gradually, I watched her become a devoted grandmother who showed up for Jenna's milestones, who babysat when we needed help, who bought thoughtful gifts instead of trying to buy forgiveness. She attended Jenna's second birthday party and cried watching her blow out candles, and I realized I was learning to separate Jacqueline from Britney's actions. She hadn't committed the crimes, and punishing her indefinitely wouldn't change what happened. We'd never be as close as before, but we were building something new that felt sustainable. Winter got a new job at a hospital across town, one with strong patient advocacy policies and a reputation for taking privacy violations seriously. The director of nursing had specifically recruited her after reading about the whistleblower retaliation case, wanting someone with her integrity on staff. Winter threw herself into advocating for medical privacy rights, speaking at nursing conferences about the importance of protecting vulnerable patients even when it's uncomfortable. She joined the advisory board for our legal fund, helping us understand healthcare systems from the inside and identify institutional barriers to reporting violations. We met for coffee every few weeks, and she told me that speaking up had been the hardest thing she'd ever done, but also the most important. She'd lost friends at her old hospital who thought she'd betrayed the institution, and the career disruption had been genuinely scary. But she had no regrets. Her courage had inspired other medical professionals to come forward about privacy violations they'd witnessed, creating a ripple effect of accountability. 2 nurses from different hospitals contacted her after seeing the documentary, asking for advice about reporting suspicious filming they'd observed. Winter connected them with Brian and our legal fund, and both cases resulted in policy changes at their institutions. 2 years after Jenna's birth, I stood in my kindergarten classroom hanging student artwork on the bulletin board while Jenna played with blocks in the corner. I was teaching again, running the legal fund with Demi, and watching my daughter grow into a happy toddler who had no idea what happened on the day she was born. The trauma wasn't gone. I still flinched when people pulled out phones unexpectedly, still had nightmares about hidden cameras, still felt a wave of nausea when I saw Brittany's name in legal documents. But I'd built a life around the trauma that felt purposeful and strong. The legal fund had helped over 200 victims in 2 years. The documentary had sparked legislative changes in 4 states. Winter was training nurses across the country on patient privacy. Kyle and I had grown closer through everything, our marriage stronger for having survived such a violation together. We'd started talking about having another baby, and this time we'd have the private, sacred experience we'd been denied the first time. We'd choose a different hospital, set even stricter boundaries, and trust our instincts about who to allow in the delivery room. Jenna looked up from her blocks and smiled at me, and I smiled back. I'd learned that healing isn't about erasing what happened or pretending the violation didn't permanently change me. It's about refusing to let one person's cruelty define my entire story, about building something meaningful from the wreckage, about choosing to move forward even. When part of me will always be stuck in that delivery room wondering how someone I trusted could betray me so completely.